But one of the things that we need to recognize about patristic theology, and especially about the Nicene Creed, is that it is already transcultural. In fact, nobody involved in the Nicene Creed had white skin. And we think of the Nicene Creed and historic Christianity as being a European phenomenon, but it wasn't. It was a transcultural, multilingual phenomenon that was expressed in the most widely spoken language of the time, which was Greek. So when we are trying to be multicultural, when we are trying to be culturally sensitive, remember, we're not reinventing the wheel because the church has done this before.
Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE, and I'm joined by some new friends. I'm unfortunately not joined by my usual co-host, Scott W. Dunford, but don't worry, he hasn't gone far. We'll have him again in our next regular episode. First, whether you're watching this show on YouTube or listening in your favorite podcast app, or maybe you found it through NRB TV or the Wrath and Grace app, we're glad that you're here, and whatever platform that you choose to use, go ahead and share the content with a friend. If the platform allows it, like it, subscribe, and do everything that you can, because that helps other people discover the content and be mobilized from it. And we're so grateful to each and every one of you who's left us a 5-star review and positive rating in Apple Podcasts in particular. That helps greatly. And this is a special edition of the Missions Podcast. So I'm not joined by Scott. Rather, I'm joined by my friend, Nathan Tromler. So you are going to be the True Value brand.
I'll take it.
Of Scott Dunford today. So we are a part of the same church network or denomination, the Bible Fellowship Church. Yep. So we first made our acquaintance with one another through the BFC connections as well.
And really at a grimy truck stop. We were
at a very grimy truck stop, yes, after we found like 2 or 3 restaurants were all closed on the same day. Exactly. So we ended up finding a random Subway to meet at. So good to see you again, brother. And you are serving at a pretty significant church. I've had the privilege of preaching at Cedar, Crest Bible Fellowship Church before and greatly appreciate the leadership there. Jason Hoy and the whole team there. Of course, our own Lauren Skinker used to be on our team at ABWE. Now he's serving with you guys.
Right.
And so we love all of the connections that are there. But tell us just briefly, this is a little bit of a podcast collaboration here. If you're watching, you notice the Missions Podcast logo isn't behind me. So this is doubling as an episode of Captivate and Conform, the Cedar Crest Church podcast. So introduce us to what you're doing, and then we'll talk with our guest in a moment.
Sure. So this, I believe, is the brainchild of our associate pastor, I guess our new senior associate pastor, Chris Von Holt, and then what do you call him, Low Skink?
Lolo Skinks is what we call Lauren Skinker.
And so this is their brainchild, and it's really a ministry to the members of Cedar Crest, but we have seen, I think, a bit of a spike in others listening in.
Right.
And in Captivate and Conform, it's trying to do that very thing, capture the hearts of people for the Lord Jesus and then see him conformed. So they'll do a whole variety of subjects. And so we were encouraged when we had this brother, Dr. Fairbairn, coming out of town, just knowing his story in academia as well as in missions as a missionary to Soviet Georgia.
Yeah, and before we introduce Dr. Fairbairn as well, you have quite a relationship with missions as a church.
Yes.
So if anyone knows anything about your church, it's that you guys are serious about the unreached, and you're taking really intentional steps in that area. So your missions conference that you do each year is about as solid a missions conference I've ever seen a church put on, and you're very committed to the Go conference. So just tell us a little bit about why missions is so close to the heart of Cedar Crest briefly.
Yes, so the heart of it is, it's really a mantle that I inherited from my predecessor. I got to give him a shout out, Brother John LaRusso.
Yes,
and
we love John.
Preceding even him, there was work by a brother, Dr. Cliff Boone, who as a youth pastor came in speaking about UPGs, unreached people groups, for the first time. And from his early influence, it really snowballed from there. They did a lot of work in Tanzania among the Sandawe peoples, saw God move in powerful ways, established churches, and now up to date, just before I came on staff, a few years before, we adopted a new people group we call the K people in Chad in sub-Saharan Africa. And so that legacy is continuing on. And we even have our missionaries here because of certain political skirmishes, and they got booted from the country of Chad.
I did see that. Yeah, I did see that.
So we're blessed to be able to have them for a season now here. So
yeah, it's all in the Lord's providence.
Indeed.
Well, we're joined also by Dr. Don Fairbairn. Thanks for joining us. And Nathan, do you want to give a little bit of introduction here? You already kind of alluded to some things, but we're joined by an expert here.
I had the privilege of first getting Don back about 3 years ago. He was delivering some lectures through Union School of Theology in Wales.
Yeah.
And I happened to just ask him some questions. And this is an ode to the kind of man he is. He was very generous to answer some of those questions, and then things went on from there. But he has taught and he can correct any of this misinformation, but he has taught for many years at Gordon Conwell Seminary. Prior to that, he was at Erskine College and Seminary. He did a PhD in patristics at Cambridge, and that was when he was coming off the field in Soviet Georgia, if that's correct. So he has one foot in the academic world. He goes to all the patristics conferences, but then he has a real heart for seeing the local church equipped, and that's why he's over, I think, largely at Union School of Theology to equip a new generation of evangelical scholarship.
Wonderful. Well, brother, thank you for joining us today, too. And enough of us bloviating. Give us a little bit more of introduction about yourself and your ministry now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And it's interesting that you want to talk about missions and also talk about my academic work at the same time, because those are very, very closely connected. When I was in seminary, everybody knew I was going to be a seminary professor eventually. There was really no question about that. The question was, what field would it be? And I always assumed that it would be New Testament. And I was planning to go into grad school in New Testament. And while I was in seminary, I got the best piece of advice I ever got from my spiritual father, the pastor of the church in Princeton, through which I had become a believer while I was an undergraduate. At a time when everybody was saying, go straight to grad school, go straight to grad school. All of my professors were saying that. My pastor said, Don, whatever you do, don't go straight to grad school. He said, Don, we are losing it in the seminaries because the professors spend their whole time in the academy. They don't know the world. They don't know the church.
Yeah.
Do not be one of them. Be a pastor or a missionary first. It was the best advice I ever got. And so I decided I wasn't going to go straight to grad school. I thought I might be a youth pastor or something first. I got out of seminary in 1989, and that's an important year because that's the year that Eastern Europe broke open, that the Soviet regime and the Soviet regime over Eastern Europe began to fall apart. But I graduated from seminary in 1989. Churches were not interested in me. One of my best friends gave me this challenge. He said, Don, if you're thinking about the will of God, you need to consider two things, need and opportunity. And there is nowhere else in the world right now that combines such great need and such great opportunity as the Soviet Union. Now you have to remember, this was 1989.
Yeah.
1989. The Soviet Union was still there. And so I decided to go to the Soviet Union for a year as a short-term missionary. And I was assigned to go to Soviet Georgia. I thought I was going to an atheistic country. It turns out that I was being sent to a country with a 1,700-year Christian heritage of Eastern Orthodoxy.
Right.
I never met an atheist the whole time I was there. I met lots of people who were only very nominally believers. I had the privilege of seeing them come to genuine faith, but I never met an atheist. My year in Soviet Georgia got me interested in Eastern Orthodoxy, which then got me interested in what we call patristics, the theology of the early church after the New Testament.
Yeah.
So when I finally went to grad school 7 years later, it was in that field. So my work in the Soviet Union reshaped what I wound up becoming a scholar of. It reshaped my ministry. It reshaped a lot of things about what I teach as well. So that's how it all began, because of a couple of really pointed statements from some mentors of mine.
So you probably resonate with the mission of this show to help goers think and thinkers go. Usually the thinkers don't go, right? They maybe stay in those intellectual ivory towers.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it was so important for me because I could have been one of those thinkers who don't go and who just write for each other and stay in the academic world. But it was so important for me to hear one of the people I respect the most saying, go first. Learn what the questions are. Learn what you need to think about. Learn what you need to think about before you go to grad school. That was really important in my life, in my ministry.
Can you just help for people maybe not as familiar with Eastern Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy, describe that connection between their dependence upon apostolic tradition, the way they understand it, and how that led you to patristic study? That makes sense. There's obviously a through line there of Greek thought. But what practically is that? If you're Greek Orthodox today, like you are very conscious of that apostolic tradition.
Yes. So in the way the Orthodox tell the story, they have had a constant line of unchanged tradition from the apostles up to the present. Right. To some degree, that's Orthodox propaganda. The actual historical situation of the development of their practice and their theology is more complicated than that, as it always is.
Yeah. Right.
But what was especially interesting to me, though, was that I was just looking at modern Eastern Orthodox theology in comparison with modern Western. And I wanted to get into the question, where did the differences come from? So my study of the early church grew out of trying to compare Eastern Orthodoxy and Western theology without knowing the history behind them. So that's what got me into the history, into the early church, into Eastern Christianity.
Like, where did that split happen, sort of?
The split between the Eastern and Western churches as we think of them, between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, is dated at 1054.
Right, the Great Schism.
Right. Really, the Great Schism was a gradual process from about 800 to 1204. The event of 1054 was actually fairly insignificant. It's just a convenient marker in the middle of it.
Yeah.
But the differences in the way the Greek and Latin churches thought about Christian life had a much older history than that, going back really to the 3rd and the 4th and 5th century.
Now, when you were still going through these studies, you eventually wrote a book on Eastern Orthodoxy. But as you're evaluating, trying to understand this church context that you're in Soviet Georgia, what struck you about these people that made you question some of the prejudices that you would have probably had about Orthodox?
In one sense, the prejudices may not have been wrong. There's an enormous amount of nominalism in Eastern Orthodoxy, and especially in Eastern Orthodox countries. Eastern Orthodoxy in the Western world is much better than Eastern Orthodoxy in Russia, Greece, Ukraine, Georgia. But in countries where Orthodoxy has a long history and is a majority, there's a very, very close tie between the national sentiment and the religious sentiment. So to be Ukrainian is to be Orthodox.
Sure.
To be Georgian is to be Orthodox. And one person once told me, in Georgia, the Bible is in our blood and Christianity is in our genes. And whether anybody ever hears the name Jesus Christ or not, he's a Christian. Now, that's obviously not true, but that gives you an idea of the kind of mentality. But on the other hand, what I found to be arresting about Eastern Orthodoxy was the idea that people have a deep devotion to God while being devoid of any kind of assurance.
Right.
So Eastern Orthodoxy today places a lot of emphasis on our effort to aspire to God. So the people that were most spiritually sensitive were the ones who were most torn up about their inability to reach God, to try to aspire to God, to try to please God. And so one of the things that I found to be most helpful when I was working in Georgia was to tell people, God has already done everything that's necessary for you to be acceptable to him.
Right.
It's all done. He's finished it. You don't have to kind of complete this process of reaching out to God, trying to aspire to God. He's done it. He's ready for you to accept him. He's ready to accept you now. So that idea of when God's acceptance comes and how that comes struck me as being a really critical difference between modern Eastern and Western theology that led me into the study of patristics.
If I could follow up on that too. So my understanding, having nowhere near your level of knowledge on the issues, but in the West, in the Latin tradition broadly, Protestantism coming out of that ultimately, we tend to focus on the forensic aspects of salvation more, and the Orthodox mind is more experiential. So a very typical Protestant question is, how can I be justified before God?
Yep.
And to some extent, that's a Catholic question too. Different answers, but similar question, similar starting point. For the Eastern mind, it's much more, how can I experience communion, or how can I ascend to the divine? The idea of theosis and other sorts of concepts. Is that true? Because what you just described sounded a lot more like, no, how can I be justified? Is that a question that they're asking, or is there work that you need to do to get Eastern Orthodox individuals thinking in that vein in the first place?
Okay, very, very good question, very big leading question. You'll notice that I didn't use the word justification, I used the word acceptance.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I discovered was that what we are talking about when we think about justification isn't just legal. It isn't just forensic. It's not just that we gain a right status before God.
Right.
It's also that God personally and relationally accepts us as being righteous because of the righteousness of Christ. And so I began to realize that another angle into the same idea was the angle of God's acceptance. And so this was when I was a missionary working with Georgians that I developed this terminology. Related to the broader thing that you're talking about, though, there's a really strong, valuable side of Eastern theology, and there's a much less valuable side of Eastern theology. And they often go by the same word, by the same terminology. You use the word theosis or deification. Deification can be understood in a very impersonal, mystical kind of sense. We're somehow absorbed into the being of God. And that's way, way too close to Eastern monism or Eastern pantheism. But it can also be understood in a relational sense. We are absorbed into, not absorbed, we begin to share relationally in Christ.
Yeah.
And therefore we share in his relationship to God the Father.
Yeah.
And so as I moved from studying modern Orthodoxy to studying the Greek fathers, I found that in certain strands of the Greek fathers, this idea of being brought into the relationship that the Father has with the Son is very prominent. And that struck me as being something really biblical, really fundamental to the Christian faith, that we would do well to emphasize more strongly in Protestantism. On the other hand, a lot of modern Orthodoxy has moved too much toward impersonal union or impersonal mysticism. And so in this case, I found that the earlier tradition of the Eastern Church is more biblical and stronger than a lot of what's being said in modern Eastern Orthodoxy.
Which makes sense.
So you would go on to eventually do your doctoral work in grace and Christology in the 5th century. Did you see any direct influence from the time that you were serving on the field moving you in that direction?
Yes, all of the questions that I explored in my PhD research and even subsequently emerged during my missions work in Georgia and after Georgia in Ukraine. Very early on, I got the idea that a different understanding of grace lay behind the differences between Greek and Latin theology or Eastern and Western theology. So that's what I wanted to look at. I entered Cambridge in 1996, planning to study grace in the Eastern Church Fathers. And I narrowed that down to studying the relation between the person of Christ and grace and salvation in the 5th century. One of the sayings that I borrowed from a famous historical theologian, his name is Yaroslav Pelikan, is Christ has to be who he is, to do what he does, to give us the kind of salvation that we have. If salvation is most fundamentally our sharing in his relationship with the Father, then he has to be the eternal Son of the Father, not just a man who's divine in some sense, but he has to be the eternal Son of the Father in order to do what he does in his life, death, and resurrection, in order to give us that kind of salvation. And I discovered this more and more clearly stated in the 5th century church fathers, especially Cyril of Alexandria, than I have found in Protestantism, although I think this is very consistent with Protestantism as well.
It is refreshing. You don't hear that relational way of thinking as much in Protestantism. We tend to be, at least as evangelicals, very reductionistic and thinking about the way in which the relation between the Father and the Son, that informs our doctrine of salvation. It's fundamentally relational. So I appreciate that greatly. Part of the occasion for this conversation is the fact that we're coming up on this anniversary of Nicaea. There's a real case to be made that in order to do missions well in the world, we need to understand not just the things that missionaries and missiologists tend to emphasize, cultural sensitivity, contextualization, but that we need to get back to our roots. We need to understand patristics. We need to understand the creeds. We need to understand our own confessions today. So what does that look like for you to help Christians today retrieve an understanding of those creedal and oftentimes patristic summaries of Christian theology? I think a lot of people would say by default, that's not useful. That was that culture's, way of summarizing the Christian faith. We're going to find a better way to summarize it now. We want each people group to be self-theologizing. Some of that's true as far as it goes, but we certainly stand on the shoulders of giants. And we need to know our roots before we can build upon those things. We certainly can't reject those, right?
Yes. And so let me try to answer that question coming at it from two different angles. In response to missiologists who say correctly that we need to be sensitive to context, we need to theologize in particular context, to say things in particular ways in order to meet the people where they are in those contexts. I'm not going to deny any of that at all. But one of the things that we need to recognize about patristic theology, and especially about the Nicene Creed, is that it is already transcultural.
Yes.
It is not a European expression of the Christian faith. In fact, nobody involved in the Nicene Creed had white skin, and really none of them were Europeans.
Yeah.
They were all Africans and Asians who happened to write in Greek and Latin, but that was not their native language.
Yeah.
We think of them as being Europeans, and we think of the Nicene Creed and historic Christianity as being a European phenomenon, but it wasn't. It was a transcultural, multilingual phenomenon that was expressed in the most widely spoken language of the time, which was Greek. It was not a Greek philosophical thing. It was not merely a Greek theology. None of them were even Greek. They were Africans and Asians who spoke Greek who were involved in the Nicene Creed. So when we are trying to be multicultural, when we are trying to be culturally sensitive, when we're trying to do all of those things, remember, we're not reinventing the wheel, because the church has done this before.
Yeah.
The church has come up with statements that were transcultural and acceptable to many different cultures in different situations, and those are worthy of our attention. So that's one angle to take. But the angle related to the content of the Nicene Creed, recognize that when we think of a creed, what we think of is a short doctrinal statement, a short confession, because confessions and doctrinal statements are what we're used to.
Right.
Doctrinal statements are long. They are about what we believe, and they are about distinguishing us from other groups. Creeds are not about any of those things.
Right.
They are short. They are about in whom we trust, to whom we pledge allegiance, to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit. And they are meant to be universal, to affirm the Father, Son, and Spirit who are trusted in and worshiped by the whole church across languages, across cultures, across nations. And the Nicene Creed, in particular, focuses on who the Son has to be to give us our salvation. He has to be true God from true God, light from light, begotten, not created, of one substance with the Father, which means everything that characterizes the Father also characterizes him. If he isn't that, he can't save us.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing the Nicene Creed does is to say, who for us men, us human beings, and our salvation came down and was incarnate and was made man. That's what he had to do. Mm-hmm. The one who is truly God has to truly become human for our salvation. So in those two affirmations, you have the gospel, you have the Christian faith in a nutshell, as expressed transculturally and as approved by the entire Christian church in the 4th and 5th centuries. And so I think that's very valuable for us to recognize we are standing on the shoulders not just of previous Western thinkers, but of previous global thinkers who have put together this statement as a way of confirming our allegiance to the Father, Son, and Spirit. There's something very missiological about the Nicene Creed that we tend not to realize.
And even the fact that it's possible to have transcultural truth is so unpopular today, even among missiologists who our whole job is to communicate truths transculturally, or at least cross-culturally. But the fact that, like, no, you really can break free of your cultural perspective in some sense because you're taking hold of, it's not that you're perfect, but it's because you're taking hold of objective revealed truth. Nathan, we on the Missions Podcast are going to end our main episode in just a moment. We'll continue into our overtime segment for Missions Podcast Premium subscribers. They can subscribe at missionspodcast.com/premium or in their Apple Podcasts app. But for those who listen to the full conversation, including the Cedar Crest family, what are we going to get into next in the conversation?
Yeah, so I think we're going to get into more of how his Dr. Fairbairn's ongoing work still is very beneficial for missiologists and really owning to your tagline for this podcast. And then we want to also get into some of his background that has shaped his academic prowess and how he's come into this with having been predominantly deaf for most of his life.
Yeah. So in the minute before we wrap this segment, any reflections on what we've been talking about so far? You know, for your church, you selected this theme. You want us to look to the past.
Yes.
Why does that matter for your people today in 2025?
Yeah, so for those who may not be aware, our Go Conference theme this year is called the Missio Dei, the mission of God, the mission of the triune God to the world. And our deep desire is exactly what Dr. Fairbairn's been sharing on, which is to understand that the mission of the triune God, rooted in, we might say in part, in a passage like Matthew 28, is transcultural. And that you can't understand the mission or to whom you're trying to bring this glorious news if you don't understand the person or persons of that glorious news. What does it mean to baptize into the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit? And so this is exactly what he's been talking about, and that this is not something that we can simply we do our American theologizing and we do it this way in Asia.
The Great Commission implies you're baptizing them into the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. You have to know who that is in order to do that task well. Very good. So we'll continue the conversation. Remember, the Missions Podcast itself is a ministry of ABWE, and you can learn more about how you can take your next steps in the Great Commission at abwe.org. If you have any questions or comments, email alex@missionspodcast.com. And until our next episode, go make disciples of all the nations.